Hello and welcome back. Settle into your favorite spot, dim the lights if you can, and let the sounds around you fade into the background. Tonight we drift far from the noise of the everyday world, out across the widest ocean on Earth to a single triangle of volcanic stone where hundreds of silent stone faces once stood, watch over a story few truly understand. Let your breathing slow, let your shoulders soften, and let your mind wander gently with me to a place at the very edge of the world. This is Rapa Nui. This is Easter Island. Close your eyes if you wish. My voice alone will carry you the rest of the way. Picture, for a moment, the whole of the Pacific Ocean stretched out before you. It alone covers more surface area than every continent on Earth combined. And somewhere within that vast, rolling blue, farther from any other inhabited land than almost anywhere else on the planet, lies a small, triangular island of just over 160 square kilometers. The nearest inhabited island lies more than 2,000 kilometers away. The nearest continental coastline, that of South America, lies more than 3,700 kilometers distant. Easter Island, known to its own people as Rapa Nui, meaning the Great Island in their language, is not simply a remote dot on a map. It stands among the most isolated, permanently inhabited places in the entire history of our species. Think of what that truly means. For centuries, generations of human beings lived their entire lives here, fully aware that no other community existed within reach, that the nearest human voice lay weeks of dangerous open ocean travel away. The island's shape is a rough triangle, formed where three now dormant volcanoes rose from the seafloor and merged at their bases. There are no permanent rivers here, no year-round streams, because rainwater sinks quickly through the porous volcanic rock. Rain falls and rain disappears into the earth almost as quickly, leaving the island's people to depend on natural pools inside volcanic craters and on clever methods of catching and storing rainwater, techniques refined and passed down across many generations. How did human beings ever come to settle such a remote and unlikely place at all? That is the first great mystery of Rapa Nui, and we will explore it slowly, gently, letting the sound of the ocean hum quietly beneath every word. Long before European sailors dared to lose sight of their own coastlines, and long before most of the world imagined the earth could be circled by sea at all, another people had already crossed vast stretches of the largest and most unforgiving ocean on the planet. These were the Polynesians, legendary navigators who set out from islands scattered across the western and central Pacific, and whose explorations eventually spanned an almost unimaginable range from Hawaii in the north to New Zealand in the south to Rapa Nui far out in the east, forming what many historians consider the widest area of maritime settlement achieved by any pre-modern civilization on Earth. These navigators carried no compass, they possessed no charts drawn on paper. Their knowledge lived instead in memory, in song, in stories handed down from elders that encoded the positions of stars, the direction and rhythm of prevailing winds, the subtle patterns of ocean swells, and even the seasonal behavior of migratory birds that hinted at land somewhere beyond the horizon. They read the night sky the way we might read a familiar book, and felt the changing rhythm of waves beneath their hulls the way we recognize a friend's voice in a crowded room. They sailed in double-hulled canoes, long vessels built from hollowed logs lashed together with tightly woven plant fiber, fitted with sails woven from palm leaves. Aboard these vessels, they carried far more than themselves. They carried an entire world in miniature, the seeds and cuttings of plants they knew they would need, live chickens, small rats that likely stowed away as an unintended but eventually useful backup food source, and a deep accumulated knowledge of farming, navigation, and spiritual life passed down across countless generations before them. Most researchers now estimate that the first human settlement of Rapa Nui occurred sometime between the 12th and 13th centuries of the Common Era, though earlier studies once suggested considerably older dates. These differences in dating do nothing to diminish the sheer magnitude of the achievement itself. Human beings in vessels that were remarkable, but still relatively simple by later standards, crossed thousands of kilometers of open ocean to reach a single, small point of land, lost within an endless, indifferent sea. Picture that moment for yourself. Weeks, perhaps months, of sailing without a single glimpse of land, nothing but water and sky, day after day after day. Doubt creeping in slowly, supplies dwindling, and still hope alone keeping the sail raised and the paddles moving. And then, at last, in some quiet and unforgettable moment, a thin, dark line appearing on the horizon, slowly resolving itself into something solid, something real. An island. Rapa Nui's oral tradition preserves a beautiful account of that very first arrival, centered on a figure known as Hotu Matua, a chief said to have led his people from a distant homeland called, in the old stories, Hiva, a place whose exact location remains uncertain today, though it was likely one among the many islands of central or eastern Polynesia. The legend tells us that Hotu Matua received a vision, or perhaps a message, carried by a spiritual messenger, revealing the existence of new land far to the east, land he was destined to lead his people toward. He prepared his voyaging canoes and set sail with his wife and his followers, carrying with them everything needed to build a new life: banana plants, sugarcane, the paper mulberry tree used for making cloth, seed tubers of yam and taro, and domesticated chickens. Upon arrival, they came ashore in a calm, sheltered bay along the island's northern coast, a place known today as Anakina, still to this day one of the most beautiful beaches on Rapa Nui, its rare white sand standing out sharply against the island's otherwise dark, rocky coastline. Whatever the precise historical truth behind this legend, however much fact has blended with spiritual symbolism across the centuries of retelling, it carries within it something undeniably real. A group of human beings arrived here, bringing with them their knowledge, their culture, their domesticated plants and animals, and found a largely untouched land, one covered in dense forest, including towering palm trees whose existence we know today only from fossilized pollen preserved deep within layers of ancient soil. Rapa Nui, when those first settlers stepped onto its shores, was an entirely different place than the one we picture today. Thick forest, enormous palm trees comparable in size to some of the largest palm species known in South America, a relatively rich diversity of plant and animal life, at least by the standards of small, isolated oceanic islands. It was, by every measure available to those early arrivals, a promising land, one that seemed to hold every ingredient necessary for a lasting and prosperous new home. Across the generations that followed, the small community founded by those first courageous settlers gradually developed into a remarkably complex society. The island's population divided itself into clans, traditionally remembered as 10 principal kin groups, each occupying its own territory across the triangular landscape of the island. Rapa Nui society was structured hierarchically. At its summit stood the Ariki Mau, the paramount chief, believed to be a direct descendant of Hotu Matua himself, carrying an almost sacred status that linked him directly to both ancestors and gods. Beneath him stood a class of priests and respected elders, then warriors, and then the broader population of farmers, fishermen, and skilled craftspeople. The island's economy rested primarily on agriculture. Farmers cultivated yam, banana, sugarcane, and the paper mulberry tree in small fields protected from the island's persistent winds by circular stone enclosures known as manavai, an ingenious agricultural technique developed specifically to shield crops in an environment that lacked the natural windbreaks found on larger, more forested land masses. Fishing supplemented this agricultural foundation, though the deep waters surrounding Rapa Nui proved less abundant than the earliest settlers may have hoped, since open ocean, far from any continental shelf, tends to support far less marine life than the shallower coastal waters found near larger land masses. Within this evolving social and economic fabric, a profound spiritual culture began to take shape, one that would eventually give rise to one of the most extraordinary archaeological phenomena in all of human history. To understand why the people of Rapa Nui carved their now famous stone figures, we must first understand their spiritual worldview. Like many Polynesian cultures, the people of Rapa Nui believed deeply in a concept known as mana, an invisible spiritual force said to flow through people, objects, and places, its intensity varying according to lineage, status, and personal achievement. It was believed that great chiefs and powerful ancestors carried an especially potent concentration of this mana, and that this spiritual force did not simply vanish upon death. Instead, it was thought to remain present, still capable of influencing the affairs of the living, blessing crops, shaping weather, and guiding the overall fortune of an entire clan. From this deep belief in the enduring power and presence of ancestors grew a pressing spiritual need, a way to keep that power visible, tangible, and permanently present among the living. This was never simply about memory or commemoration. It reflected a firm and sincere belief that ancestors, properly honored, would continue actively protecting their descendants and blessing their land. And from this belief emerges the most famous legacy this small island has ever produced: the moai. The moai, those towering stone figures with elongated faces, heavy brows, long noses, and pursed lips, were never mere decorative artwork. At their core, they served as physical embodiments of specific honored ancestors, typically chiefs or other significant figures who had passed away. Each moai was carved to hold a portion of that person's spirit and mana, standing guard over the land of its clan, its gaze typically directed inward toward the village and community it was meant to protect, rather than outward toward the ocean, as popular imagination often mistakenly assumes. The vast majority of these figures, numbering close to 900 across the island, were carved from a relatively soft volcanic rock known as tuff, quarried almost exclusively from the slopes of a single volcanic crater, Rano Raraku. This volcano was far more than a simple quarry. Over the centuries, it transformed into an enormous, open-air carving workshop, and to this day, dozens of unfinished moai remain scattered across its slopes, some still attached directly to the bedrock, as though the carvers had simply set down their tools one afternoon and never returned. The size of these figures varies enormously. The smallest stand barely a meter tall, while the largest completed and successfully erected moai reaches roughly 10 meters in height. Yet one single unfinished figure, still lying within the quarry itself, known as El Gigante, would have measured more than 21 meters had it ever been completed and raised, a scale that would have made it the largest single carved monolithic statue ever produced anywhere in the ancient world. The carvers worked with relatively simple tools, handheld picks fashioned from basalt, a volcanic stone considerably harder than the soft tuff they were shaping. They worked with extraordinary patience, carving the front and sides of each figure while it remained still attached to the bedrock behind it, leaving a thin connecting ridge of stone intact until the very final stage of the process. Once the front carving was fully complete, the moai was carefully detached from the rock face, then moved to a nearby pit where it was partially buried to allow the carvers to finish detailing its back. This explains why so many moai found today along the slopes of Rano Raraku appear buried up to their shoulders. They were caught mid-process in a long and carefully staged production sequence. For decades, one particular question fascinated researchers and visitors alike. How were these enormous statues, some weighing many tens of tons, transported from the quarry to their final resting places, sometimes many kilometers away across rough, unpaved terrain? Popular imagination once conjured images of supernatural forces or even extraterrestrial intervention. But modern science, together with the oral traditions long preserved by the Rapa Nui people themselves, offers an explanation that is far more grounded in reality and arguably just as astonishing. The statues, it turns out, walked. Rapa Nui's oral tradition holds an evocative but strikingly precise expression. The statues, they say, walked from the quarry to their final locations, moved by the mana, the spiritual power, they themselves carried. For many years this was dismissed by outsiders as pure legend, poetic symbolism, rather than literal description. More recent research, however, has revisited the claim from a completely different angle. In the second decade of this century, researchers conducted a striking practical experiment. They built a full-scale replica of a moai, matching its size, its shape, and its subtly forward-tilted base. Using ropes tied around the head and both sides of the statue, a modest team of people, working in careful, rhythmic coordination, pulled the ropes in alternating side-to-side motions. Through this technique, the replica statue was able to genuinely walk forward, rocking gently from side to side with each pull, in much the same way a person might rock a heavy refrigerator forward rather than trying to push it directly. This discovery did more than simply solve a technical puzzle. It restored a measure of credibility and respect to oral traditions maintained for centuries by the descendants of the island's original inhabitants, traditions that turned out to be considerably closer to the scientific truth than many of the more elaborate theories involving wooden rollers or massive sledges proposed by early outside researchers. This does not necessarily mean every single moai was transported using this exact method. Different techniques were likely employed depending on distance and terrain, but it offers us a far clearer picture of the remarkable engineering intelligence and social organization that Rapa Nui's ancient society genuinely possessed. Moai were never placed randomly across the landscape. They stood atop carefully constructed rectangular stone platforms known as ahu, precisely designed architectural structures usually built along the coastline that served a dual purpose. On one hand, they functioned as elevated display platforms for the statues themselves. On the other, they served as communal burial sites for the bones of a clan's ancestors. Some ahu were modest in scale, supporting only a single statue. Others were massive and elaborate, holding an entire row of moai standing shoulder to shoulder. The most famous example of this type is Ahu Tongariki, which supports 15 moai standing side by side in a breathtaking arrangement, especially striking at sunrise, and which was carefully restored and re-erected in recent decades after centuries of lying, toppled and scattered. Some ahu walls were constructed with astonishing precision, built from massive stone blocks cut and fitted together with remarkable tightness and accuracy, entirely without the use of any binding mortar, a building approach that echoes, in a broadly similar spirit though without any direct connection, comparable stonework achievements found in other ancient cultures around the world. The ahu functioned as the spiritual and social heart of each clan, a place where rituals were performed, offerings made, and the community gathered together, whether in celebration or in times of hardship and need. The statues standing atop them served as the ever-watchful eyes of the ancestors, a constant, comforting presence woven into the daily rhythm of community life. Between roughly the 14th and 16th centuries of the Common Era, Rapa Nui's society reached the height of its cultural flourishing. The population grew steadily, reaching, according to various estimates, somewhere between 7,000 and 15,000 people, a substantial number given the island's limited land area and modest natural resources. During this golden era, different clans competed with one another to carve larger and increasingly detailed moai, a form of social and spiritual rivalry that reflected each clan's relative status and strength. The wealthier and better organized a clan, the greater its capacity to devote labor and resources toward carving even more impressive statues and constructing more elaborate ahu. Craftsmanship flourished across many domains. Delicate wood carving produced small figures representing emaciated ancestral spirits, known as moai kava. Skilled hands produced fishing and farming tools, wove cloth from the bark of the paper mulberry tree, and even developed a unique and highly distinctive form of pictographic writing, one we will return to shortly in greater detail. But this prosperity, as we will soon see, carried within it the seeds of a profound challenge, one rooted in the complex and delicate relationship between human ambition and a limited natural environment. When the earliest settlers first arrived on Rapa Nui, they found an island covered in dense forest, most notably an enormous species of palm tree believed to have been among the largest of its kind found anywhere in the world, alongside other trees and shrubs that supplied wood for canoes and houses, fiber for rope making, and fuel for cooking and warmth. But as the population grew and as the demand for timber increased, likely including the use of tree trunks as rollers or sledges to help transport some of the heavier stone statues across long distances, and as agricultural land expanded through continued clearing of natural vegetation, the island's forests began a slow and steady retreat. A second environmental factor compounded this pressure. Rats, which arrived on the island either accidentally or deliberately alongside the first human settlers, and which found in the seeds of the native palm trees an abundant and easily accessible food source, significantly hampering the forest's natural ability to regenerate itself across successive generations. By some time around the 17th or 18th century, the dense forests once known to the island's earliest ancestors had all but completely vanished. Large trees sufficient for building strong, ocean-capable canoes were no longer available. Soil fertility declined as it lost the protective cover once provided by trees, becoming increasingly exposed to wind and erosion. Sources of fuel and building material grew steadily scarcer. As natural resources dwindled, mounting pressure bore down on the entire community. Agricultural yields declined. Deep-sea fishing became considerably more difficult, as the ability to build larger canoes capable of reaching richer offshore fishing grounds diminished. Available resources shrank at a time when the island's population remained relatively high. This period has traditionally been portrayed in popular accounts as a complete and rather sudden civilizational collapse, closely tied to a concept often called ecocide, a narrative in which the community is depicted as having essentially destroyed its own environment through an obsessive drive to carve ever more statues, disregarding the ecological consequences until it was simply too late. However, more recent archaeological and anthropological research presents a considerably more nuanced and balanced picture. Some contemporary studies suggest that the dramatic pre-European population collapse long assumed to have occurred may not have been quite as severe as once believed, and that the community in fact demonstrated notable adaptive capacity in the face of changing environmental pressures, adjusting agricultural methods, relying on protective, stone-walled field techniques like the manavai mentioned earlier, and gradually shifting sources of subsistence. None of this suggests that Rapa Nui avoided real environmental and social hardship. Rather, it suggests that the island's story is considerably richer and more complex than the simplified narrative many of us grew up hearing, and that the single most dramatic and consequential chapter in the island's fate was not in fact authored by its own people alone. As pressure on available resources intensified, relations between different clans grew increasingly tense. What had once been a relatively peaceful rivalry, expressed through competitive statue carving and ceremonial display, gradually hardened into more serious conflict over land and dwindling resources. During this period, a striking pattern began to emerge: the deliberate toppling of moai. Oral tradition and archaeological evidence together suggest that rival clans would topple the statues belonging to competing groups, likely as a symbolic act intended to destroy the mana, the spiritual power believed to reside within the statue, thereby weakening a rival clan's spiritual and social standing. By the time the first Europeans arrived on the island in the 18th century, most moai still stood upright in their original positions. But over the following decades, the pattern of toppling continued steadily until, by the late 19th century, not a single moai remained standing on its original ahu anywhere on the island. All had either fallen naturally or been deliberately toppled, and they remained lying scattered across the landscape for many decades until modern restoration efforts beginning in the 20th century gradually began returning a number of them to an upright position once more. This period of internal tension, significant as it was, proved to be merely a prelude to a far harsher chapter in the island's history, one carried in on ships arriving from a distant horizon. As the traditional importance of moai carving and the rituals surrounding the sacred lineage of the paramount Ariki gradually declined, a new religious and social practice rose steadily in prominence, one considerably more competitive and dynamic in character, known as the cult of Tangata Manu, the birdman. This tradition centered on a god known as Make-Make, and was observed annually at the ceremonial village of Orongo, perched dramatically above a small rocky islet just off the island's southwestern coast called Motu Nui. Rival clans sent representatives, typically strong and courageous warriors chosen specifically for the task, to compete in a genuinely dangerous contest. Descending steep, treacherous cliffs, swimming across open ocean waters sometimes populated by sharks, to reach the small offshore islet, and then waiting there for the arrival of the season's first sooty tern egg from a migratory bird known locally as the manutara. Whoever first located an unbroken egg and successfully carried it back across that same dangerous return journey without damaging it was granted the title of Tangata Manu Birdman for a full year, and his clan was granted for that same period a range of special social and religious privileges, including preferential access to available resources. This new cult reflected an important shift within the broader structure of society, a movement away from a rigid hereditary system centered on a single sacred bloodline toward a considerably more competitive framework, one that offered different clans a genuine opportunity to attain elevated status through individual achievement and collective effort. These rituals continued right up until roughly the mid-19th century, when external forces intervened and altered the island's trajectory in profound and lasting ways. Among the most fascinating mysteries within Rapa Nui's cultural heritage is a unique writing system known as rongo-rongo, carved into small wooden tablets using intricate rows of pictographic glyphs, arranged in an unusual pattern known as reverse boustrophodon, in which a reader moves along one line from left to right, then physically rotates the tablet upside down to read the following line in the same direction once again. This script has never been fully and reliably deciphered, despite numerous attempts by researchers from around the world over the years. The tablets were first documented by European missionaries in the 1860s, at a point when the original knowledge of how to actually read these symbols had already largely faded among the local population, as a direct consequence of tragic events we will turn to shortly. It is believed that this writing system was never intended for everyday use, but was instead reserved for a small specialized class of priests and scholars, perhaps used to record sacred genealogies, ritual calendars, or important religious chants. of the roughly 25 known original tablets preserved today in museums scattered around the world, no living person remains who can confidently read them, leaving this unique piece of cultural heritage silent, carrying its secrets away from us, perhaps forever. On the 5th of April 1722, Easter Sunday, in the Christian calendar, Dutch exploratory ships under the command of Admiral Jacob Roggeveen arrived at the island's shores. Roggeveen had originally set out in search of an entirely different, legendary landmass, but instead became the first documented European to set foot on this remote island. Because of the date of his arrival, he named it Easter Island, the name by which the outside world has known it ever since. Roggeveen and his crew recorded a scene that struck them with considerable astonishment. Relatively friendly local inhabitants and enormous stone statues standing in significant numbers whose method of carving and transport deeply puzzled them, given a population that appeared, from their limited perspective, to lack advanced technology or metal tools. But this first encounter, though it began as a relatively amicable exchange, also marked the beginning of a chain of events that would ultimately alter the island's fate in tragic and lasting ways. Just days after their arrival, a violent incident occurred in which Dutch sailors opened fire on a group of local inhabitants, killing several of them, an early and troubling sign of the kind of relationship that would come to define the following decades of contact between the island and the outside world. Following Roggeveen's visit, decades passed before other European ships returned. In 1770, a Spanish expedition under Captain Felipe González arrived, conducting what is considered the first formal written survey of the island. Local chiefs signed, in their own particular manner, a document that the Spanish considered a formal cession of sovereignty to the Spanish crown, though the true meaning of that signature to the island's inhabitants themselves remains uncertain and debated to this day. In 1774, the celebrated British explorer Captain James Cook visited the island during one of his major Pacific voyages of discovery. Cook and his expedition noted a striking change compared to Roggeveen's earlier account. The island appeared considerably poorer, and a significant number of statues appeared to have already fallen from their platforms, suggesting that the internal tensions and deliberate toppling described earlier were, by that point, already well underway. In 1786, the French navigator Jean-François de Gallo, Comte de la Pérouse, visited the island as well, leaving behind detailed written accounts and important illustrative drawings documenting the island, its people, and its statues during that particular period. These successive visits, though separated by considerable stretches of time, together served as a prelude to a far more intense and devastatingly consequential period of contact still to come. Throughout the 19th century, Rapa Nui endured a series of tragic events that came close to erasing its entire society altogether. It began with intermittent visits by whaling and sealing ships, some of which introduced European diseases against which the island's inhabitants had no natural immunity, triggering deadly epidemics that claimed a considerable portion of the population. But the most devastating blow arrived in the 1850s and 1860s, when Peruvian slave-trading ships targeted the island directly. In 1862 alone, an estimated 1,000 to 1,500 people, roughly a third of the island's remaining population at the time, were forcibly abducted, including the paramount chief himself and a significant number of elders and traditional knowledge keepers, and taken to work under conditions of near-total servitude in guano mines and plantations across Peru. This event proved catastrophic on multiple levels. The island lost an enormous portion of its population outright, but even more critically, it lost most of the elder and priestly class who carried its deep oral knowledge, quite possibly including the ability to read the Rongorongo script discussed earlier. Following international pressure and religious intervention, a small number of survivors were eventually returned to the island, though many of them had already contracted diseases such as smallpox, which they then carried back with them. triggering yet another devastating epidemic that further weakened the already fragile community. By 1877, the population of native Rapa Nui Islanders had fallen to a mere 111 people, a tragic figure that reflects the sheer scale of the human catastrophe that befell this small community within the span of just a few decades, following centuries of prior flourishing. In 1888, the Republic of Chile formally annexed Rapa Nui, a step that permanently reshaped the island's political status. But for many decades following annexation, the island's native inhabitants lived under fairly harsh conditions, with vast stretches of island land leased to private sheep ranching companies, and the native population effectively confined to a limited area around the main village of Hangaroa under restrictive policies that persisted for generations. Rapa Nui was not granted a more autonomous administrative status, nor were its native inhabitants granted full civil rights until later stages of the 20th century, following years of sustained local effort and advocacy for recognition of their cultural and land rights. Despite everything endured across these difficult chapters, the descendants of Rapa Nui's original inhabitants demonstrated remarkable cultural resilience, preserving what remained of their language and traditions and identity, and pursuing with real determination the ongoing task of safeguarding their ancestors' legacy and reviving important aspects of it, an effort that has borne increasingly tangible fruit as modern archaeological research has progressed. Beginning in the mid-20th century, scientific and archaeological interest in Rapa Nui grew considerably. International expeditions, including a well-known Norwegian expedition led by the explorer Thor Heyerdahl in the 1950s, conducted important field research, though some of Heyerdahl's original theories regarding the origins of the island's population have since been substantially revised in light of modern genetic and linguistic research, which has firmly confirmed the Western Polynesian origin of the island's people, rather than a South American origin as Heyerdahl initially proposed. Over the following decades, archaeologists from many different countries, working alongside the island's own native descendants, collaborated on ambitious restoration projects. A number of fallen moai were carefully re-erected on their original ahu, most notably in the restoration of Ahu Tongariki during the 1990s, which returned 15 statues to their original, awe-inspiring formation. In 1995, UNESCO added Rapa Nui to its World Heritage List, formally recognizing its exceptional cultural and historical value to humanity as a whole. Today, the island stands as an important tourist destination, carefully balancing the preservation of its sensitive archaeological heritage with the steady arrival of visitors from around the world, each one coming to see these silent stone giants with their own eyes. Today, Rapa Nui is home to roughly 7,000 residents, the majority of them descendants of the island's original native population, alongside Chilean and other international residents. The island maintains a distinct administrative status within the broader Chilean governmental framework, with growing recognition of native cultural and land rights over recent years. Archaeological and anthropological research continues to yield new findings nearly every year, steadily reshaping and enriching our understanding of this singular society, moving us further away from oversimplified older narratives toward a picture that is considerably richer, more complex, and, above all, more deeply human. Today, roughly half of those enormous stone statues remain standing, some proudly upright once more, on their original platforms following patient restoration work, others still lying exactly where they fell centuries ago, and a third group remaining forever in the place of their birth, within the quarry slopes of Rano Raraku, unfinished, as though quietly waiting for a carver who set down his tools one day, long ago, and simply never returned. There is something quietly humbling about standing, even only in imagination, before a row of moai at dawn, watching the first light spread slowly across their weathered stone faces. These are not simply monuments to the dead. They are, in a very real sense, an act of enduring love, a promise made by the living to those who came before them. You will not be forgotten. Your presence will remain among us. Your protection will continue to be felt. Consider, for a moment, the sheer scale of coordinated human effort required to bring even a single moai into being. The careful selection of stone, the patient labor of skilled carvers working for months, the delicate, dangerous work of moving many tons of solid rock across uneven terrain, using nothing more than rope, timber, and the disciplined coordination of many hands moving as one. And then the raising itself, likely accomplished gradually, using wooden levers and carefully placed stones to inch the statue upward, degree by degree, until at last it stood upright, facing its village, facing its people, forever. Every one of these 900 statues represents not simply an artistic accomplishment, but an entire web of social cooperation, shared belief, and collective purpose. A single moai could never have been created by one person alone, nor even by a small handful of people. It required an entire community, united by a shared understanding of what mattered most, willing to devote enormous time and effort toward honoring those who came before them. It is tempting, when looking back at Rapa Nui's history, to reduce it to a single cautionary tale, a simple story of a society that consumed its own resources until nothing remained. But the deeper we look, the more we find a story defined not by simple collapse, but by adaptation, endurance, and remarkable continuity. The people of Rapa Nui adjusted their agricultural methods when their environment changed. They shifted their spiritual and social systems when older structures no longer served them, giving rise to new traditions like the Birdman cult. They preserved, against extraordinary odds, memory, language, and identity through some of the most devastating chapters any small island community has ever faced, chapters brought upon them almost entirely by forces arriving from far beyond their shores. There is something profoundly moving in recognizing that the greatest threats to Rapa Nui's people and culture came not from their own choices in isolation, but from disease, violence, and exploitation introduced by outside contact. And yet, despite everything, their language still exists today. Their descendants still walk the same volcanic soil their ancestors once cultivated. Their statues, patiently restored stone by stone, still stand facing their communities exactly as they were always meant to. In recent decades, the Rapa Nui people themselves have taken an increasingly active role in shaping how their own history is researched, told, and preserved. Local archaeologists, cultural custodians, and community leaders now work directly alongside international researchers, ensuring that traditional knowledge and oral history informs scientific interpretation rather than being set aside in favor of outside assumptions alone. This shift matters enormously. For so long, Rapa Nui's story was told primarily by outsiders, sailors, missionaries, and foreign scientists arriving with their own preconceptions and theories. Today, a growing and vital part of that story is being reclaimed and retold by the very descendants of the people who lived it, who continue to carry its memory forward, generation after generation, exactly as their ancestors once carried memory forward through song and spoken word alone. It is a quiet, patient kind of work. Much like the carving of the moai themselves, it requires immense care, immense patience, and a deep respect for what came before. And slowly, piece by piece, tablet by tablet, statue by statue, a more complete and more honest picture of this remarkable island continues to emerge into the light. As we come to the end of tonight's journey, I want you to picture one last time that long, unbroken line of statues along the coast of Ahu Tongariki, standing quietly in the pale light just before sunrise. The ocean stretches out endlessly behind them, exactly as it always has. The wind moves gently across volcanic grass that has grown and withered across countless centuries. And the statues themselves stand utterly still, facing inward, facing home, exactly as their carvers intended so many generations ago. There is a profound stillness in that image, a stillness that feels, in its own quiet way, deeply restful. It reminds us that even the grandest human achievements eventually settle into a kind of peaceful silence, one that asks nothing of us except that we remember, and that we carry a small piece of that memory forward with us gently, the way the people of Rapa Nui carried their own ancestors forward across so many generations of hardship and hope alike. And so our story comes to a close for tonight. It was the story of a people who crossed the widest ocean on Earth with extraordinary courage and who built, in their profound isolation, a singular civilization that left behind a silent legacy of stone still capable of captivating hearts and minds across the entire world today. The story of Rapa Nui is not simply a story of enormous statues or puzzling ancient engineering. It is, at its heart, a story of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of extraordinary hardship, of memory carefully preserved against every attempt to erase it, and of descendants who still stand today on that same remote volcanic soil, proudly carrying the name of their ancestors forward. The next time you happen to see an image of one of those quiet stone faces, remember that it is far more than carved rock. It is a distant echo of an entire civilization, of dreams, hopes, and knowledge belonging to people who once lived and loved and struggled and dreamed in much the same way that we still do today. Thank you for joining me on this quiet journey tonight. I hope it carries you gently into a peaceful, restful sleep, full of calm and beautiful dreams. Good night.